All right. Well, welcome everyone to our second evening of our second annual virtual film festival, co-hosted by the Listening Point Foundation and the Sigurd Olson Environmental Institute. My name is Steffi O'Brien. I'm the executive director of the Listening Point Foundation, and my co-host this evening is Alan Brew, director of the Sigurd Olson Environmental Institute at Northland College. We are so happy to have all of you here with us. If you're back for night number 2, welcome. And if you're just joining us, we're happy to have you with us. Our panelists this evening will be introduced by Alan here in a minute, but first I wanted to just go over a couple things for everyone here tonight. Your questions are welcome. Down at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. Please feel free to press that, submit your question, and we will try to work them into our discussion, or Alan will do that. He's pretty good at it. And then we are also recording this session, and along with the session on Thursday, they will be available for folks to view after the fact, or if you're only able to stay for a little while. And last but not least, if you were unable to view the films before tonight's panel discussion, I know there was a little bit of confusion with the links this year. We'll do better, but we'll be posting them in the chat, so you will be able to view them later. They are free to view on YouTube, and you're welcome to do that. But the discussion will be really interesting either way, so please do stick around. And I think our discussion will probably last for about an hour, and then yeah, we'll see where we are about then. So Elaine, if you want to come into view here, and hopefully Dylan will be back in just a moment.
Yeah, it looks like we just lost Dylan for a second. So, well, thanks, Steffi. Welcome to all of you from me as well. As Steffi said, I'm the director of the Sigurd Olson Environmental Institute at Northland College, and I'm really pleased and excited to be partnering with the Listening Point Foundation on these film festival events. So, and excited to be back again tonight with a little bit different focus. Diana's focus on forest was a little wetter than the focus is going to be tonight, I think. And so we'll kind of explore the other side of forests with fire tonight. I'll say just a couple of words about Lane and Dylan, and then we'll get started with questions, which will kind of carry us through the evening tonight. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Lane's work, Lane is joining us from Duluth, Minnesota this evening. He works as a research forester at the Cloquet Forestry Center, so just south of Duluth. His primary research, and you can correct me if I'm wrong about this, Lane, but his primary research focus is fire ecology, particularly of red pines in the Great Lakes region. And then he also has a real interest in kind of bringing together tree ring analyses and historical records as a way of better understanding the ecological and cultural history of fire. And I think we'll hear a lot more about some of that work that he's done as we work through the evening tonight. And then Dylan, I don't know if you want to, you can turn your camera on, or maybe Steffi can turn that on for you if you're ready. There we go. Welcome, Dylan. Dylan Bizhikiins Jennings is currently a Heal doctoral fellow at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He also serves on the Wisconsin Governor's Task Force on Climate Change. And Dylan and I know each other well because he's also teaching for us here at Northland College and has for a number of years. And so he's here in a little bit more expanded teaching capacity this year, which we're really excited about. And it's been super to have him on campus and working with our students. Dylan also founded the Bizhikiins Culture and Dance Company. And we may get a little glimpse into that tonight, but if not, he's got a nice website that explains the work that he does through that endeavor of his as well. So Dylan, welcome. It's great to have you here with us this evening. And I think we'll just go ahead and jump in with questions. I had one, it seems like a source question, I guess. So we hear about lightning started fires, wildfires, and of course we hear about human set wildfires. And I was wondering, are there other sources of ignition for wildfire other than those sort of two ways of fires starting?
Yeah, I think globally there's, volcanoes is one example. Kind of spontaneous combustion from decomposition, and sometimes you can have long burning sources of fire, like coal veins that catch, or peatlands. So maybe the source of the original fire is from people or lightning, but then long term it's kind of this holdover fire that can last for multiple seasons. So I think that there's certainly multiple ways fires can start or reoccur in a landscape, but certainly lightning and people are the most prominent. And then the frequency of those ignitions certainly varies across continents and based on physiography and climate.
Okay. Okay. And are there any differences in how the fire itself plays out? And so maybe I'm just guessing accidental human ignitions and lightning ignitions maybe play out in a similar way, but if you all are doing prescribed burns, how different is the way that plays out in terms of how the fire actually, develops and manifests itself?
Boy, that could be a really long discussion on its own. Like I'd say the biggest thing between lightning and human caused fires oftentimes is kind of the seasonality of the fires. And that, here in the Great Lakes region, we tend to only have lightning started fires during the summer months when you have convective thunderstorms and lightning that comes with not too much wetting rain. Whereas, the spring and fall seasons can be a time where fuels are very receptive to human ignitions. And so really people historically expanded the fire window into the shoulder seasons, spring, fall, basically any time when there's not snow on the ground.
Okay.
So then present day, we're kind of with prescribed fire controlled burns, we're mimicking that same thing that happened historically. And we can light summer burns, but we tend to have prescribed fire seasons that fall in that dormant period, so to speak, in the spring or fall. And then certainly depending on the season and the fire weather during that time period, the conditions or the fire behavior is going to be dramatically different during a controlled burn relative to a wildfire, both like rate of spread of the flames and then kind of the amount of heat that's released and how quickly it moves through a site. So there's a lot of different variables, and there's similarities and certainly lots of differences. So that's a whole presentation onto itself.
I bet. That sounds good. Dylan, maybe you can jump in here too, but for both of you, were there sort of ritualized or cultural rhythms to fire ignition historically when it was an integral part of people's culture, both in terms of kind of time of year, but also maybe length of time between settings and those types of things?
You want me to start that one out? Is that, yeah?
Sure, that'd be great.
From my understanding, and something that, is really, it can be really difficult for all of us to do, is to simply decolonize, right? How practices, might have been done, or, really, really start to think about what life was like, a long time ago. And, from some of our oral tradition, like, yeah, there's a big ceremonial aspect to any time we light a fire, but you have to also have to understand too that, it was such a normal part of everyday living that, there, it was just kind of one of those things, I think, that, we did, without, true, kind of like when we go and we might pick berries or harvest a medicine or harvest, something, right? Obviously there's obviously some kind of mode or form of reciprocity or some kind of a ceremony or practice done that we as Anishinaabe continue to do and have done. But it was so more normalized at that point in time, right? That I think these days, right, we try to recreate this big picture, I think it was just an everyday practice, that was conducted, various times of the year.
Okay, yeah, interesting. Anything you'd add to that, Lane, from your work?
I really like Dylan's answer that it is something that was so routine that my sense is that ethnographers and other people that were sort of new to the Great Lakes region didn't even take a lot of time to document it extensively, or they didn't understand that fires were being intentionally lit and they associated it with carelessness. So I would say that it was just something that was kind of ever present, commonplace practice, but certainly connected to reciprocity and just living on the land and making sure that there's reliable availability of particular resources that are fire dependent or fire adapted. For those of you that are really interested, there's an archival film called Fires of Spring. It was put together in 1978 by an anthropologist named Henry Lewis, and he documented traditional fire practices with Native communities in Alberta. And the documentary film is really spectacular. You can find it on YouTube. It's called Fires of Spring. And I think that kind of captures this generation that's passed on and their knowledge of sort of traditional practices that were present prior to like the fire suppression era really ramping up in Canada. And so that film, I think, had some analogs to the Great Lakes region, maybe not always with the strict seasonality of spring burning, but thinking about the kind of fuels that are receptive to fire in the springtime, and then the reasons to burn as far as, for habitat or to reduce insect populations or to maintain travel corridors, things like that. So that's a great film. I'd highly recommend checking it out. And it hasn't been online for a very long time. So maybe just in the last year or two, it's been available. People have discovered it and been sharing it.
Oh, that's neat. Yeah, that sounds like a great reference. Thank you.
Yeah.
Just one last question along this thread. Do we have a sense of how far back in human history the intentional use of fire goes? I mean, we're talking tens of thousands of years. I mean, do we have any way of knowing or a sense of any evidence of when that might have started in terms of humans' interactions with landscapes?
Dylan, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, sure. I can't cite any specific archaeological evidence right here at this very moment, but I know I've come across reports or similar research that indicates we're talking 10,000 plus years that some of these practices have been carried out in certain areas, right? And obviously every region is different, right? We have to look at specifically how the landscape was at every certain juncture in time, and also what types of kind of like Arniji here was talking about, right? What kinds of purposes they would have served, right? Whether it was to maintain ungulate populations in a certain area, certain prairies, or whether it was for berry purposes, or whether it was for other types of spurring biodiversity. Really depends, and really specific to the area. I think that's really important to remember too, right? Every community, even to this day, right, specializes in specific things, right? We talk about even even 1800s, 1900s, the devastation of buffalo populations, bison populations in the West, drastically impacting some of those communities. And so some of those remove fire practices, also come into play there as well.
Super, thank you. One of the questions from our participants is about current forest fire. Let's see. What is the philosophy now among forest fire suppression managers? So it's not specific to an agency. I understand that there has been some change after the Yellowstone fire when so much wonderful new growth emerged. Do they let fires burn now? If so, how is it decided? And you may need to narrow that to different agencies, I suspect.
Yeah, here in Minnesota, the Minnesota DNR, which is a primary, agency responsible for fire suppression on state lands and private lands, they still have a strict fire suppression policy. So even if they were in a situation where they wanted to let a fire burn because it was meeting certain ecological parameters, or it was in an area that that there's not a lot of values at risk, homes, private property, other infrastructure, that legally they're not allowed to do it. Whereas the U.S. Forest Service has more flexibility on the national forests, and then like the National Park Service as well. They've got opportunity to use managed wildfire in certain landscapes to meet ecological objectives. And so more and more fire managers that are working for the federal government, because they have that flexibility, they're in some cases looking at every single ignition and asking the question, do we need to put this out, or can we let this kind of do its thing, and do its work on the ground, and we'll just monitor it and make sure that we have resources that we can send to that burn if it looks like it's going a way that they're concerned about it causing damages. So I'd say there is a movement to letting more fires burn, and a lot of it depends on how droughty it is and how early in the season it is, and then also where it is on the landscape. And so certainly the Superior National Forest and some of the fires that have been lightning started fires in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, and then Quetico Provincial Park on the Canadian side, they're letting fires go. And just in Ontario, the Quetico Provincial Park, they have like around 114,000 acres that burned in 2021.
Wow.
And those were lightning started fires that they opted to let burn and do their thing. And the Quetico Park biologist says it is the first year since the 1960s that they've met ecological objectives for area burned in Quetico Provincial Park. So the newspapers reported as a disastrous fire year, but ecologically, the biologist views it as a great success. So there's this great contrast between how media wants to portray fire at times and what we know it actually needs to do on the landscape, and how we, value those burns. So
yeah. One of the questions that came up on Thursday night's discussion was about wilderness and the general practice with wilderness of letting it be, if you will. What is, are you aware of shifts there too? So on the one hand, you would let lightning fires just burn in wilderness, although I think they've been suppressed as well over the years. But what about now, as we understand the use of fire as a positive management tool? Are there shifts happening with wilderness managers as well, and within our wilderness areas?
Yeah, that probably varies from region to region quite a bit. I know here in northern Minnesota, the Superior National Forest, the fire crews and the wilderness managers are more open to letting lightning fires burn. Human ignited fires are still put out. They're not considered to be natural. And I there's a lot of discussion right now on whether or not prescribed fire within the wilderness to meet objectives besides public safety is something that should be allowed. And I think that that's kind of the frontier of wilderness fire discussions right now, is whether or not we should be actively reintroducing fire to these areas where we've kept fire out for so long, or if we should just let lightning fires come and slowly kind of break up the homogeneity of fuels on the landscape. So that's could be a very long discussion, and it'll be interesting to see how things play out over the coming years. It's very much how people feel. It's like an emotional decision, a social sort of decision, rather than like driven by the science and what we know the ecology of these systems is. So,
but it is an active discussion, it sounds like, ongoing.
Yeah, I hope so. I would really like to see more conversations on that front, and more consensus on what the right strategy is.
Yeah. Dylan, you
you-
were, oh, go ahead. Yeah, go
Dylan,
ahead.
do you have any thoughts on that? Fire management within wilderness and what that means from a tribal perspective?
Yeah, I think, you know, we had this interesting conversation the other day. I was helping do a cultural training for the Wisconsin DNR, and they talked about just the ethics and the perspectives of resources, and even just the word management, right? And, you know, even in our survival realms, sometimes the word management, right, can be a taboo word, because, you know, within our language systems, you know, we have animacy embedded in everything that we talk about, right? And fire is one of those things that's very much alive, right? And so being as a spirit, being at that, you know, we talk about how culturally significant it is, you know, it's kind of a foreign concept to think of it as something that we manage, right? With that being said, it's also important to note that, you know, our presence, you know, as Indigenous people and as just human beings in general, is something that, you know, contributes and helps our environment. We know that to be true, right? A lot of times we talk about these, you know, ancient prescribed burns, you know, being started by communities, right? And so I think, you know, sometimes the answer isn't just to remove our presence from certain areas. And we, you know, we look historically, we've had that, you know, human beings have practiced that a lot, especially, you know, in, you know, the early organization in the United States, you know, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, we're starting to set aside, you know, nature preserves and sites that really don't want to do anything with, right? And got to ask yourself, is that kind of negating some of those traditional principles of, you know, having our presence on those landscapes, right? And so I think, you know, in general, there's not always, you know, a right answer, but, you know, I think that by, you know, allowing communities to, you know, especially our Indigenous communities, to have basically a seat at the table to help weigh in on some of those decisions. You think about I was thinking about a lot of the policies that a lot of these agencies work under, you know, the auspice of, right? And a lot of these agencies, you know, their policies reflect, you know, a lot of, I guess, like ancient colonial institutions, right? And the practices that have been done for a long time. And so it's like, maybe we need to start revisiting how some of these agencies operate in general, right? To better reflect ways that capture those, you know, those ways of knowing.
Dylan, I think you in the Oshkigin film references the burns that happened on Stockton Island in the Apostles. I think you were part of some of that work. Was that technically wilderness that that project was happening in, or was it outside of some of the wilderness boundaries? Do you know?
I want to say it was, but that was already years ago.
Okay.
You know, I can only kind of speak to like what the planning that went into it, and then even up to the event that was out there, and the kind of the ceremony and things that were practiced.
Okay. So that wasn't a kind of focal point of the discussion. It doesn't sound like whether it was or wasn't wilderness at that time.
That portion of
I don't recall that.
Okay. Go ahead, Lee.
Alan, that portion of Stockton Island, the Presque Isle part, the
Yep.
Tombolo, that's not part of the wilderness area in the
Okay.
islands. So I think that's part of what actually enabled those burns to occur. And I think the
Okay.
conversations would have been very different if it was on the other side of the wilderness boundary.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you. We have another question. So related to Native peoples in the Great Lakes, including Canadian areas, participant is wondering, did all of those groups practice burning of lands for various purposes? Do we know the answer to that question? How widespread was the use of fire kind of in the Great Lakes area?
You know, I from what I understand, it was pretty heavily utilized. I can't, you know, something that we should not get in the practice of is saying like all indigenous communities, right? Because then we throw every single unique, distinct nation together into one group, and every community, right, has its own way of life, its own language, its own dialects, its own specific area and niche, grown to maintain intimate knowledge with. And so I think the best way to say it, I think it was heavily used in this region, maintain biodiversity. Like I said, also, we know also to potentially maintain certain types of species. And I don't know that we know 100% that every single community and every single community probably practice some form of, we know for a fact, right, some form of ecological or biological practices that help to maintain the function.
Okay, super. As a I guess a partial follow-up to that, again, some of our participants wondering, Dylan, if you could talk a little bit more about the types of ceremonies that might occur before a burn, at least within the communities that you're familiar with.
Yeah, so our language is what we, what and how we communicate with the
Oops. Looks like we're losing you a little bit there, Dylan.
Can you still hear me okay?
You just came back.
Can you
Well, we
hear me
lost
now?
you for a minute there. Yeah.
Okay, I was just saying that our language, with our ceremonies, our language is really what helps to guide and let the different spirits and beings that we're working with know and understand what we're doing, right, and what we're trying to do. And so that's a major part of these ceremonies, as well as are utilizing our tobacco and other kind of tools that are used to kind of convey the messages that we're trying to get across, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. One of my questions was about the language of fire, if you will. I'm curious if maybe both of you could speak a little bit to that. So often, and I think you referenced this, Lane, when you were talking about the Quetico a minute ago, so often, especially large wildfires are described in sort of catastrophic terms or terms of devastation. The descriptive language is often has negative connotations of various sorts and sort of even cataclysmic sort of connotations. And I'm just curious if both of you could talk a little bit about your understanding of how those language choices are, I guess, reflecting cultural attitudes on the one hand, how changes in language might also help drive different understandings and ways of thinking about fire in the future. And again, I'd be curious for both of you to kind of take a run at that one.
I'll wait for Dylan to go first.
You will, huh?
I would always say that we really do have to watch what types of language that we use, because that also affects public opinion heavily. When we use words like invasive species, when we use words like fight, right? All of these types of things that evoke emotion, evoke negative attitudes, right? And also cause anxiety too, right? When you see nothing on the news but people fighting fires, right? And I guess the chaos that gets that surrounds the vernacular that is utilized. We have to understand that fire in essence is doing its work, right? Like I said, we acknowledge it as a living being. And so however it was started, however it was created, aside from that, it's doing what its role is in the environment. We have teachings that tell us that fire is one of those elements that was here before human beings, right? And to that point that we as human beings are also dependent upon fire. And so we're really taught at a young age in our communities to have a lot of respect for it and revere it as such, and very much treat it as a being. And that's how we talk about it. That's how we treat it. When you start to treat it as a thing, or you start to treat resources as as a commodity of sorts, right? Or just something simply for aesthetics, you lose a lot of that those strong ties and that reverence for those things. And I think that's really evident in our languages. Our Ojibwe language is extremely descriptive, and many indigenous languages are extremely descriptive, and sometimes don't have those really sharp connotating words that are harsh, in my opinion, right? Versus how English can be at times. So just a couple thoughts.
Just a real quick follow-up for Dylan. When you mention your language being particularly descriptive, are you referencing in relationship particularly to fire as well? In other words, a rich sort of language or descriptive language around fire and its variations, those types of things?
Yeah, I think there's fire is used for so many different things, and when we use it for different things, we're able to describe that in our language, right? Whether it's for cooking and providing, sustenance, or whether it's for the purpose that we're talking about and spurring biodiversity, or, whether it's a fire that's utilized in one of our ceremonies, celebrating life, right? There's all these different ways that fire is used, and we're taught different ways to talk about that in our language.
Super, thank you. Go ahead, Lane.
Dylan, I think, captured a lot of it with his response. I think just kind of flipping the script a little bit and thinking of fire as a gift, kind of because of our agrarian roots in the Midwest, we talk about rain, like how we need the rain. It's a good thing it's raining. We need the rain. And like this past year with the amount of smoke in the air, the amount of fire on the landscape in northern Minnesota and northwestern Ontario and elsewhere, we need the fire. And that really is kind of a gift if it's in the right place. And so thinking about prescribed fire as gift giving, this kind of act of reciprocity with the land, and that instead of being firefighters, we can be fire lighters, or you can be a fire steward. And that certainly there's a lot that language can do to change the context that we kind of assign these wildfires and prescribed fires to, make them what they really are, which is a gift. So I'll leave it at that.
I'm going to change gears a little bit. We received a question about tree size. So the initial question is, why don't large trees burn? And then as a follow-up, are there certain types of trees in northern Minnesota or in the Great Lakes area that generally survive fires better than others? The individual mentions, seeing fire scars on tall white pines in older forests. And so just curious, again, if either of you might respond to that a little bit.
Yeah, large trees do burn when they're surrounded by lots of other smaller trees. And so it really, whether or not a large tree survives a fire depends on the amount of fuel that's around, both underneath the crown of the tree and then just kind of on the site as a whole, and then the amount of heat that's released from those fires. But kind of just generally speaking, red pine is probably our most fire fire adapted species in northern Minnesota. Thick insulating bark. It's a self pruning tree, and it can be fire pruned as well. And so when the kind of the base or the lower limbs of the tree are removed either from self thinning or self pruning or from a light fire, it becomes more fire resistant or more resistant to future burns. And then just the resinous nature of red pine wood. When a red pine tree does scar, it exudes a lot of resin to that damaged portion of the tree base, and it seals that wound almost like a scab on your own skin, and that prevents disease or insects from getting into the heart or sapwood of the tree. So there's all these great adaptations of red pine that demonstrate from like an evolutionary standpoint that it does well in sites that are fire maintained. Even the flammability of the needles. And then white pine, I would say, is also fire tolerant when it's of a large size, but not as much as red pine. And then I would say oak species by and large are a fire loving tree type. So if you think about bur oaks or red oaks, those are typically growing on sites that were fire maintained historically and would benefit from fire reintroduction if you're trying to promote more oak on a site like that.
Could you go just a little bit deeper on the differences between white and red pine? How are they different so that one is more fire tolerant than the other? Just a few more specifics about those differences, because we especially in the northern, we tend to see them together often, and I'm just curious about a little bit deeper into the biology maybe there.
Yeah, I mean, just real generally, I think that red pine is on sites oftentimes because of the fire history on that site, and whereas white pine is there in spite of that fire history. And so white pine just doesn't have the same resinous wood, and so when it is fire damaged, it tends to be more susceptible to rot. And of course, rot in a tree makes in some cases those trees more susceptible to wind disturbance, or they're just not as long lived. And then just thinking about the flammability of the needles of white pine versus red pine, if you take a clump of red pine needles and burn it, say in a campfire, you'll notice that the flammability of those needles is drastically different than a clump of dried white pine needles. So there's just a lot of it has to do with kind of the fuel that accumulates on the site, and then the growth form that those trees have, and how quickly they put on thick bark, and then the resinousness of the wood, which is distinctively different if you were to cut into a red pine and give it a smell versus a white pine that has a much different fragrance, less resinous. So,
and then how about jack pines real quick and where they fit in?
Yeah. And then I think of jack pine as very flammable. The bark and the needles, like everything about those trees suggests that they are fire loving. And instead of trying to resist fire with thick bark or by self pruning their branches when they're more mature, they're essentially trying to make the site more flammable in some ways, so that when a fire does come through, they're able to burn hot, and then start a whole nother generation of jack pine on that site. And so we're seeing those kind of different characteristics play out in places like the footprint of the Pagami Creek fire in the Boundary Waters, where sites that had a lot of jack pine are coming back with thick jack pine 10 years later, whereas areas where you had superstory or overstory white pine, that those white pine trees were killed from the very hot fire that came through, and there's not a white pine seed source available locally to have new white pine establish. So it's those different characteristics certainly determine the future forests at those sites when they do burn.
And is that the jack pine is, I'm trying to remember, is it the serotinous cones, is that, did they release in heat and fire? Is that correct?
Yeah, there's like a waxy coating on some jack pine cones that when it's heated up either in the sun or from a fire, the cones will open up and release their seeds over time. And so that's certainly a great example of a fire adapted trait. But not all jack pine cones, or not all jack pine trees, are serotinous. There are populations across jack pine's range that have non-serotinous cones, or a mix of serotinous and non-serotinous cones on the same tree. So locally, like in the Chequamegon Bay area, if you go out to Long Island, you'll find that some of the jack pine out there have non-serotinous cones, and that's likely kind of a population trait on the island that's connected to a lack of fire on that landform over time.
I had no idea. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah. Follow up question quickly. Wondering if you could speak to regrowth after a fire, how fires inspire biodiversity in our forests. And I don't know if it'd be appropriate at this point. One of the other questions, maybe these relate, so I'm going to throw this one out there at the same time. One of the other questions I had is there was a reference in one of the films to fire pausing forest succession. And I was just curious if you could maybe do a quick primer on forest succession in the Great Lakes region, and at what point in that succession does fire pause things, if you even agree with that statement, I guess, which you may not. So sorry, I threw two questions at you. The first one is focused on just a question about the regrowth after a fire, and how that encourages biodiversity. That was quite a bit of the focus of the Into the Black film, is how the fires are increasing biodiversity quite a lot.
Yeah, in some cases, sites that experience fire can be less biodiverse because of the species that are coming in. But then when you think about, the landscape as a whole, when you have areas that have experienced no fire for some time, you have other areas that have experienced fire more recently. Suddenly at the landscape scale, you do have quite a bit more biodiversity. And so there's habitats and there's food sources for all different kinds of wildlife, not just, fire loving or more fire phobic species. And so I think the biodiversity thing, it's like, it's a question of scale a little bit. And are you focusing at a site level, or are you looking at like a larger area? But by and large, fire kind of maintains these early successional plant communities that are a bit more vigorous from like a grasses and forbs. There's more sunlight coming to the forest floor because there's oftentimes less tree canopy. And so that creates forage and browse for a lot of different species that appreciate grass. So thinking about like deer and elk and moose, they all benefit from sort of like fire maintained forest conditions. Certainly, like that's what enabled bison to kind of be in Northwest Wisconsin historically, is them kind of moving up through the Northwest Sands in these fire maintained areas. And then just like the vigorousness of growth that's coming in on these fire maintained sites, like again, northern Wisconsin, blueberries and raspberries and sand cherry, like that's all stuff that is producing heavily, like fruiting much more on fire maintained sites than if it was kind of laying dormant in a shady understory. And so of course that productivity then is good for animals that are looking for things to eat, and it kind of affects the whole ecosystem. So it's yeah, so I guess I'm hoping that answers the question a little bit. And then as far as pausing succession, I think it depends on the fire. And so I think what Damon was referring to there is kind of maintenance burns that would be kind of creeping through an understory of a red pine, like a coastal red pine site, and where it limits the growth of more shade tolerant species that would come in beneath red pine and basically removes those, almost like it's landscaping the site and creating a more grove-like setting that you could see through, and that would be more of higher value from a cultural standpoint for medicines or for habitation. So there's strategic value in kind of keeping the understory open to make those sites more hospitable. So I think that's what Damon was getting at. It does sort of hold a site in an intermediate sort of phase, but where the shade tolerant trees aren't coming in, but it's also not completely resetting the site to like a barrens or a place that is without any trees. So
Thank
complicated.
you. Yes, yeah, it sounds like it. This question about a recent executive order of President Biden's, he signed an executive order saying that federal land managers must consider traditional ecological knowledge in their decisions. And the question is, do you think we've turned a corner in balancing different sources of observations in managing public lands with that executive order?
That's a really good question. And getting back to like Lane's point just about, fire, and I also have to, agree with him on all of his points he made. And I think it gets back to not only the ethics, but the perspectives, right? When we're talking about, some people might say management, other people might say relationship, right? Oftentimes those lenses that Indigenous communities have are, they're really based in longevity, right? Extremely long-term thinking and planning, right? We might be, some of these effects from these fires, might be felt, 20, 30, 100 years down the road, right? But, a lot of these things were probably planned in that way, right? To think about things versus present day management is often rooted in, a year, 2 years, 5-year plans, 10-year plans, right? That aren't significantly thinking, extremely long term. And so I think that's also something that, in addition to, that executive order that you mentioned, also have to be considered is also the very lens in which that we consider, that timeline of management practices. I think it's turning a corner. I think it's a really good thing that even the notion of traditional ecological knowledge is being considered, in this administration. I think a lot of communities expected it to, even considering that we have a Native woman in the Department of the Interior, for the first time ever. But I also think that how that all gets implemented, really will affect whether there's longstanding or good change, right? And like I said, a lot of the policies and even the very government itself and the way that it operates, operates in a very colonized fashion, sometimes that isn't conducive to our traditional knowledge systems and how those operate. And so it'll be interesting to see how things go.
A follow-up question is, I think looking for some specific examples, wondering if you have examples of what's been done in this area, sort of the Great Lakes and where you're working, Lane, examples of how those different knowledge systems have been bridged in regards to human relationships to fire. So wondering if one or both of you have had particular experiences of seeing those different knowledge ways of knowing coming together and actually then resulting in different decisions perhaps.
Well, locally with the Apostle Islands, I mean, and this was highlighted in the video a little bit, the film, the blueberry burns that have occurred out on Stockton Island. And like, I don't think that those burns would have happened if there weren't community members, with Red Cliff or Bad River or elsewhere that said, oh yeah, like, Stockton Island has a history of blueberrying, and that fire use on that particular portion of the island was commonplace prior to it become like falling into state management back in the 1940s. So I think that's a great example where, okay, the memory of the community has really shaped the management activity that's occurring out there now, and that's a way of kind of honoring the history of the tribal communities in the Apostle Islands area, and kind of letting that shape and be an opportunity for interpretation, not just like ecological restoration at a site, but kind of incorporating it into the visitor experience and allowing people to think differently about that place, how it's been used over millennia. And then where I work at the University of Minnesota Cloquet Forestry Center, we're really actively trying to get prescribed fire onto our 3,400 acres in collaboration with the Fond du Lac Band and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And we're using the tree ring record available on site there. We have, records of fire history, fire scars from red pine that go back to the 1700s. And then we can kind of blend that with, information from community members that are part of the Fond du Lac community, recollections that they have from that their parents or grandparents shared with them, or just kind of combing through oral history records that have been transcribed and are available publicly. And so I think where I'm working, we're making a huge effort to kind of honor the past by drawing on both indigenous knowledge and Western science to kind of help us understand what the land needs, which is more fire.
Dylan, I don't know if you have other examples, and actually I'm going to pull up an earlier question too. When you had referenced working with trainings for the Wisconsin DNR, one of our participants wondered if there are areas other than fire or in addition to fire where agencies are working with you or others to kind of, again, bridge those the traditional ecological knowledge and Western science and other approaches.
Yeah, I think just more broadly, climate change is one of those broad issues that is affecting all sorts of different forms of subsistence and cultural practices. And that's an area that, I think the state has, continues to engage a lot of our tribal nations on, in a deeper, more meaningful level, and understanding that many tribal communities, because of this extreme tie to, what we might know as resources, they're disproportionately impacted by these things. And so, there's been good conversations and some good work around that as well, even on the climate change task force. I'd have to go back to Lane's point about, fire, at least around here. I think some of the better relationships that I've seen come out of all that, have been, the examples of the apostles there and some of that firework there, kind of setting the scene. I see a lot of other entities, states, and tribal communities working closer to do this kind of work after they saw how it was done there. And I think I can't speak for any tribe, but I know that if you approach a community and you give them the reins to do what they know ecologically to be good for these places that they have intimate ties to, it goes a lot better than saying we're going to let you do something, right? Or we're going to that's typically how it goes, right? Is an agency says, well, we're going to let you do this or let this happen, and assert its authority in a way that pretty demeaning and also diminishes the knowledge bases that exist here. And so, I didn't see a whole lot of that with the apostle, with the work with the apostles, right? It was more or less like, kind of help guide us along this road. And I think that makes a huge difference when, when collaborating and working with these communities, have them guide a lot of these processes.
Thank you. I have one more technical question and then kind of a forward-looking question, kind of about students and education. And I'm giving you we're getting close to the end, and so I just going to frame that up a little bit. One of the questions I had thinking about prescribed burns and how broken up our forest lands are by roads and other, built aspects of the built environment. And I'm just curious about, so even doing prescribed burns, how does that end up being different when it's in such small little chunks as opposed to fire at a different time in the history when they wouldn't have had those artificial boundaries on woodlots or other sorts of things? I guess it's a scale question. Does fire over large areas or fire that's unbounded by those artificial boundaries lead to, again, different results than what, even as we try to recreate the use of fire, we have these imposed boundaries that we're having to honor? And how much of an impediment, maybe, I'm not sure that's the right word, but I guess I'm just curious about how those two things play together and what the differences might be.
I think what we're seeing is that because of the differences in ownership across the landscape, and then just fragmentation of forests, for agricultural purposes or roads. I mean, roads can and fields can be super useful for implementing prescribed burns, but the ownership differences and things like that, what it ultimately means is that we're burning much less than we ought to be in a lot of places to be doing ecologically meaningful work and possibly culturally meaningful work as well. So thinking about like the Muckwa Barrens where you live nearby, there's maybe 20,000 acres that are being managed with prescribed fire by the Chequamegon National Forest. But when you think about the amount of landscape that was historically maintained, where you had kind of barrens and pine savanna that ran all the way from Washburn, Wisconsin, down to Grantsburg, Wisconsin, and the St. Croix River area, we're really just maintaining a small fraction of a much larger landscape with prescribed fire. And so that, I think that's going to have consequences for biodiversity long term. So thinking about like sharp-tailed grouse or like elk reintroduction, it kind of limits the viability of some of those populations long term. So we really need to be thinking about partnerships and collaboration and working across ownerships. And so I think really that question gets at why these discussions about fire are so important, is that it's like everybody can contribute and help in some way in restoring fire to specific sites, whether it's just being a cheerleader on the side, or if you're a private landowner, think about how you can be working with the state if maybe they're your neighbor, or there's all these landscape collaboratives that form out west to be thinking about how to restore fire to certain watersheds or other key areas. And I think we would really benefit from having more of that in the Great Lakes region.
Thank you. Anything you'd add to that question, Dylan?
No, I tend to agree with that. And I'd also just might say that, even present day, it's really tough to see. It can be difficult to figure out where some of our knowledge systems fit into present day management, right? Because, we're talking about oftentimes this really strong innate connection. And so, trying to figure out, what type of relevancy, it bears. And I also think that despite everything that's been, documented, a lot of our knowledge and our traditions are, oftentimes passed down orally, right? And so you think about, just this long line of knowledge that, there's probably a lot of it that, isn't documented or, isn't searchable, right? And so I don't think we'll ever truly know how much we lose when we don't have these traditional practices in place, right? Kind of like you don't know if we've never experienced it, right? And so I think that's important to know. And I think also, considering what types of things are important to our communities in general in this day and age, right? Is it blueberries that you're after in a specific area again, right? Is it to promote certain species? Like I know, in the state here, the tribes in the state and other entities have been big on trying to bring back Oshkigins or elk populations, right? Is it to promote, healthy habitat area for them. I mean, you really have to think about what it's for. And I always cite some of this research that was done, in Cree country, Blackfoot country, about, and actually making some of my students read a book right now about basically about the importance of certain, keystone species to some communities, right? And that, for whatever reason, right, you talk about beaver populations, here in the Midwest help, fuel things like the fur trade, but we're also significant in other factors. When you think about the beaver out west and in Cree country, beaver were extremely significant for helping to maintain surface water for buffalo populations, right? So that intimate connection there, right, probably isn't it's still important, but probably not as important as it was a long time ago, right? And so you really have to fast forward it to present day to figure out what community priorities there are, and what knowledge you have left to kind of bridge those gaps.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We're not returning to something, necessarily in the past. I mean, we continue to move into the future. And yeah, that's a really interesting point. Okay, we'll wrap up with this question. It's about young people. Seems an appropriate place to end. So the question is, if a young person wanted to learn more about fire uses and work constructively with it, what course of study should they pursue? Forestry, ecology, wildlife management, some combination of those, or maybe others. And then as a follow-up to that, once they've done those studies, is service in a federal agency a better option for somebody invested in fire than in perhaps a state agency because of current philosophies, although again, that may differ by state. So I'll let both of you take a crack at that, and then maybe we'll wrap things up for the evening.
Yes, I can go first. I would say, as far as a discipline, like all of the above, forestry, ecological restoration, conservation biology, fish and wildlife, like all of those disciplines can benefit from kind of a fire perspective, or can offer a fire perspective, depending on the landscapes or the subject matter. And, not all forests need fire necessarily at frequent scales, and not all wildlife does either, but certainly a key component. So I'd say, do what you feel is best for you, and then think about how you could integrate fire as sort of part of that discipline. And then, yeah, as far as like agency connections, 11 years ago, I was doing seasonal kind of collateral duty firework with the U.S. Forest Service, but we were primarily kind of doing summer fire suppression work. And then I was working in the winters with the Nature Conservancy doing prescribed fire very frequently. And so if you want to kind of get your feet wet and have some experience with fire on the ground, going with a non-governmental organization that's really interested in prescribed fire versus prioritizing fire suppression as their fire management responsibility, that's a great way to see fire on the ground and really learn more about fire ecology and fire effects. You'll see way more fire doing prescribed fire than you will doing fire suppression in the upper Midwest. So consider that as an opportunity. And there's great seasonal fire jobs doing prescribed fire work all over the country with the Nature Conservancy and other nonprofit organizations. So consider that as one option for getting some experience on the ground and learning quite a lot in different landscapes.
Super, thanks, Lane. Yeah, go ahead, Dylan.
Yeah, I'd say definitely listen to Lane. I'll double up on that. You could also take my environmental history course at Northland. That's always an option. We do talk about fire and a lot of traditional ecological knowledge in general, how it works and also affects, also informs scientific ecological knowledge and the differences and the barriers and all that. But I would definitely, you know, encourage you to consider, you know, different types of agencies. I would never rule out working for a tribal agency as well, or a tribal government. Many times they're on the foregrounds and able to kind of yield their sovereignty in ways that allow them to engage in this type of you know, traditional relationship or management practice. And so tribes are always hiring, looking for everything from foresters to you know, to firefighters, all that. And so you know, many of our communities are really eager to find young and old people that are very fascinated, interested in helping, you know, restore some of these practices. So that would be some of my recommendations.
Super. Well, thank you both so much for being with us this evening. Really appreciate your sharing of perspectives and knowledge around these issues. And as you said at the very beginning, Lane, much of this I'm sure could be many, many sessions as we dig deeper and deeper. But thank you so much. I'm going to turn it back to Steffi now with a couple of kind of final comments to close the event and series. And so thank you. And thank you all to those of you who have been participating in the audience this evening too.
Yeah, thank you, Ellen. And thank you especially both Lane and Dylan. This was a fantastic evening full of just wonderful thought-provoking things. And for everyone who is with us this evening, again, this session will be up on the Listening Point Foundation website. Some point here later in March, we'll have it live in case you know folks who are unable to make it. And there will also be a small survey coming out next week just to help us refine and fine tune our event for next year, hopefully when we have it again for our third go round. So again, thank you all for being here. Thank you, Lane. Thank you, Dylan. If you guys want to just stay on for just a moment afterwards, I think we will